Summer 1943. Sicily baked under a merciless sun, the heat turning olive groves into wavering mirages and the dusty roads into rivers of powder. The Sherman tank rumbled forward like a steel beast, its tracks grinding over parched earth. Inside the cramped belly of the machine, 5 men sweated, every breath thick with the stink of fuel and human tension. Lieutenant Jack Harrington crouched in the commander's cupola, binoculars pressed to his eyes, scanning the jagged horizon. His shirt clung to him, streaked with grime and sweat, but his jaw was set, his blue-gray eyes sharp. Somewhere ahead, hidden in the folds of Sicilian hills, German 88s waited, patient predators with their muzzles pointed at the narrow road the column had no choice but to take. "Radio check," Harrington said, voice low but steady. Corporal Eddie Ramirez, hunched over the radio set, answered with a faint grin that didn't quite hide his nerves. "Loud and clear, Lieutenant. Channels clean." He adjusted the dial, listening to the soft hiss of static. That sound, faint, constant, was the heartbeat of the crew. Without it, they were deaf and blind. "Loader, how we doing?" Harrington called. Round-chambered, came the reply from Private Billy Kane, a 19-year-old whose freckles were hidden under soot. His hands trembled just slightly where they gripped the shell. Sergeant Paul Red Donnelly, the gunner, kept his eye glued to the sight. "Let's hope we see him before they see us," he muttered, voice rough as gravel. The driver, PFC O'Malley, didn't speak. He kept his foot light on the clutch, guiding the Sherman through a curve. Dust plumed behind them, catching in the sunlight like smoke. The air outside was quiet, unnaturally so. Even the cicadas seemed to have fallen silent. Then, a flash, distant but unmistakable, somewhere beyond the ridge. The report of an 88mm gun cracked through the stillness, a whip crack that echoed like the sky itself had split. "Incoming!" Harrington shouted. The shell screamed overhead, slammed into the dirt behind them, showering the tank with soil and shrapnel. Kane flinched, nearly dropping the shell he held. "Keep it together," Donnelly barked. "We're not dead yet." Ramirez twisted a knob, speaking into the mic, his voice calm despite the sweat running down his temple. "Command, this is Jackal 1. We've got eyes on muzzle flash, North Ridge, grid 7-5. Requesting fire mission or flanking orders, over." A pause, then the headset crackled with life, a voice, urgent but precise. "Jackal 1, swing left off the road." "Repeat, swing left. Enemy guns are fixed on the column. Execute flanking maneuver and push through Orchard to your 9 o'clock. "Copy," Harrington said. He slammed a hand on O'Malley's shoulder. "Left. Take us through that grove before they dial in." The tank lurched off the road, crashing through low stone walls, olive branches scraping against the armor. Another shell whistled down, striking where they'd been seconds before. The blast rattled the teeth of every man inside. "Loader on your toes," Donnelly said through clenched teeth. "Already there," Kane whispered. The grove swallowed them, shade cutting the brutal glare. Dust turned to dappled light on the turret. Harrington peered through his periscope, spotted movement, a flash of gray between the trees. "Panzer 2 o'clock," he shouted. "Traversing." Donnelly swung the turret. The gun whined as it lined up, the sight jerking until the Panzer came into view, a hulking Mark IV, its turret turning toward them. "Fire!" The gun thundered. The shell leapt from the barrel, striking the Panzer's side with a deafening clang. Smoke belched from the enemy tank, but it didn't explode, just shuddered, its return shot going wild, tearing through the branches above. "Hit but not out," Donnelly snapped. "Loader." Kane rammed another round home, sweat dripping from his chin. "On the way." The second shot smashed into the Panzer's track, immobilizing it. This time, smoke poured out of the hatches. The crew bailed, dark figures scrambling from the wreck like shadows. "Hold fire," Harrington said, voice quieter now. "Let the infantry take them." The men inside the Sherman exhaled as one. The radio hissed softly. Somewhere back on the road, more Shermans followed, turning left just as they had. The ambush was broken. But Harrington didn't relax. He wiped grit from his forehead, listening as the radio filled with chatter, units reporting positions, casualties, kill confirmations. Somewhere in the chaos, he caught a distant, terrified voice calling for a medic. "They knew we were coming," he said finally, more to himself than to the crew. "Yeah, but we knew they were waiting," Donnelly said, voice grim but tinged with pride. He tapped the radio box with a knuckle. "This little box is the only reason we're breathing." Outside the grove, the battle continued, machine guns rattling, mortars thumping, the sky smeared with oily smoke. Harrington knew this was just the beginning. Sicily was only the first step, the first rung of a ladder that would stretch all the way to Berlin. Miles away, Oberleutnant Karl Brenner stood beside his immobilized Panzer, watching black smoke curl into the sky. His crew gathered near him, shaken but alive. Brenner's jaw was tight, his eyes scanning the horizon as if trying to see through the dust and gunpowder haze. "How did they know?" one of his men asked quietly. Brenner didn't answer. He had been fighting the Americans long enough to feel a gnawing certainty. They moved like they had a sixth sense. Every time his guns were in place, every time he prepared the perfect kill zone, they shifted, flanked, came from angles he hadn't anticipated. He looked back toward the burning Panzer, then at the distant sound of Sherman's advancing. Something invisible was guiding them. Something he couldn't hear. Harrington's tank emerged from the orchard, joining the others as they pushed forward toward the next village. Dust swirled in golden shafts of sunlight, coating their hulls like war paint. Inside, Ramirez adjusted the radio, clearing static. A new order came through, crisp and unbroken. Push forward, cut the road to the retreating Germans, hold until reinforced. Harrington grinned despite himself. The crew snapped back to readiness. "Let's go make some history, boys," Donnelly said, his tone half grim, half exultant. The Sherman roared ahead, turrets swiveling like an eager predator. Behind them, the road where they had almost died still smoked, a scar on the earth. Ahead lay more hills, more fire, more waiting ambushes. But they were ready, connected by invisible threads of sound. Far behind enemy lines, Brenner climbed into the back of a staff car, the wind carrying the acrid smell of defeat. He stared out at the rolling hills, at the sky that seemed too blue for such carnage. His thoughts turned not to tanks or guns, but to silence. The fatal silence between his units, the runners shot down before delivering orders, the phones cut, the time lost. Somewhere out there, the Americans were listening to one another, talking, singing through the smoke. He closed his eyes, and for the first time since the campaign began, he felt a chill despite the heat. The war was changing, and he feared he already knew who would master it. As the day burned on, the sound of engines, the crackle of radio chatter, and the relentless advance of Shermans filled the land. In the shadows of ruined farmhouses, German soldiers waited, still fierce, still defiant. But the rhythm of the battlefield had shifted. The Americans weren't just fighting with steel and fire, they were fighting with something unseen. And for the first time, Brenner understood the shape of the war to come. Not a war of silence, but of voices carried through the air, of orders given and obeyed in seconds, of tanks that seemed to know where to turn before the first shot was fired. The sun dipped lower, casting the battlefield in molten gold. Harrington's crew pressed on, the radio whispering like a ghost in Ramirez's ear. Every man felt it, the sense of being part of something larger, something almost unstoppable. And somewhere beyond the next ridge, the next village, the next day's fight, history was waiting, and they were coming for it. The battle for the ridge ended before dusk, leaving the air thick with the stench of scorched metal and cordite. Harrington's Sherman sat hulled down behind a stone wall, its engine ticking like a cooling beast. The crew emerged into the heavy evening air, stretching stiff limbs. Dust clung to their faces, streaked by lines of sweat. Somewhere in the valley, artillery rumbled as other units cleared pockets of resistance. But for now, their world was quiet except for the faint crackle of the radio set still alive inside the tank. Ramirez crouched near the tank's rear, cigarette glowing faintly as he stared at the radio through the open hatch. He had been trained to treat it like sacred equipment. Waterproofed, calibrated, checked and rechecked every morning before they moved out. Tonight he touched it like a reliquary. "Damn thing saved our skins again," he murmured. "Not just ours," Harrington said. He stood a few feet away, scanning the horizon. Whole column. If they'd stayed on that road another 2 minutes? He let the sentence trail off as if unwilling to imagine the carnage. Red Donnelly walked up, wiping grease from his hands. "Makes you think," he said. "Back in training they told us radios were fancy extras. Now I'm thinking I'd take one of those over an extra inch of armor." "Don't let ordnance hear you say that," Harrington said with a faint smile. But his mind was elsewhere, turning over the battle like a puzzle. They had flanked in time, struck first, saved lives. But why were they the ones with that gift? Why did the Germans seem blind when they had the better guns, the better tanks? As night settled over Sicily, Harrington sat with Ramirez inside the tank's turret, the glow of the radio dial casting green light across their faces. Static whispered like distant surf, punctuated by occasional bursts of chatter. Ramirez adjusted the frequency slightly until the signal came sharp and clear. Voices passed reports, fuel levels, coordinates, requests for engineers. They were invisible threads knitting the battlefield together. You ever think about what this means? Ramirez asked, surprising Harrington. I mean, this thing, we're talking to guys 10 miles away like they're sitting next to us. Feels like cheating. It feels like winning, Harrington said, but there was no arrogance in his tone, only wonder. The next morning, they received orders to move toward a nearby airfield recently captured from the Italians. Trucks rattled past them on the road, bringing supplies and medics. In the back of one, Harrington saw stretchers lined with wounded men, faces pale under dust. Some had bandaged stumps where legs had been. He caught Ramirez looking too, his expression tightening. If the radio gave them an edge, it was measured here, in the number of living men who might otherwise have been dead. By midday they reached the airfield, where a cluster of tents and signal trucks formed a humming nerve center. Antennas bristled from the vehicles like insect feelers. Men with headsets sat over field tables, pencils scratching maps as they relayed messages. Harrington had never seen anything like it, a web of coordination that stretched from the front lines to divisional HQ and back again. Major William Rucker greeted them there, a tall man with wire-rimmed glasses and a sunburned nose, sleeves rolled up despite the heat. He shook Harrington's hand with a grip that was both firm and distracted, as though half his mind was still following some invisible conversation on the net. "You're Harrington's crew, right? The ones that broke that ambush yesterday?" Rucker said. "We've been tracking your transmissions. Textbook work." "Credit goes to the radio," Harrington said. Rucker smiled, faintly amused. "Credit goes to the men who know how to use it. We can build 1,000 of these sets, Lieutenant, but they're just so much metal until someone's listening." He gestured for them to follow him to one of the signal trucks. Inside, the air buzzed with low chatter from multiple frequencies. A corporal switched between channels, relaying artillery requests, reporting minefield clearances. Rucker pointed to the map spread across the wall. "Every red pin is a tank with a radio. Every blue pin is an infantry company with a set. Every green pin is an artillery battery we can call on. Look at it. This is how we fight now, not as isolated units but as one body. Hit here, reinforce there, adjust in real time. It's the difference between chaos and coordination." Donnelly leaned against the doorframe, arms crossed, skeptical. "So you're saying this is why we're beating them? Not better tanks, not better guns, just better chatter?" Rucker looked at him, not offended but grave. "I'm saying this is why we're not losing more men than we already are. The Germans are good, very good. But most of their tanks? Half of them don't have radios, and the ones that do can't talk as fast or as clear as ours. They're fighting half-blind. By the time they know what we're doing, we've already done it." Ramirez ran a hand over the smooth casing of the truck's radio set, his fingers lingering on the dials like a pianist touching keys. "Feels like we're holding the future in our hands," he said softly. Rucker nodded. "We are. Don't forget it." That night, as they bivouacked near the airfield, the crew sat around a small fire. Someone from another unit passed around a can of peaches, and for a few minutes the war felt far away. Kane, the youngest of them, asked if the war might be over soon, now that they had taken Sicily. Donnelly snorted softly. "Kid, this was the easy part. We've got a whole continent waiting for us." Harrington watched the flames dance, thinking of Rucker's map, the pins spreading like a slow contagion across Europe. He imagined radios whispering in the dark, guiding columns through rain, through mud, through the snows of some distant winter. If they could keep talking, keep hearing one another, maybe they could get through it. But he also thought of Brenner, though he didn't yet know his name, and men like him on the other side, clever, stubborn, fighting with whatever they had left. They wouldn't stay deaf forever. The next day brought rain, a sudden summer storm that turned the roads to muck. The column slogged forward, Sherman tracks churning deep ruts. Ramirez cursed as water seeped through the seams of the turret, dripping onto the radio set. He wrapped it in oilskin, kept wiping the dials with a rag. "Don't you die on me now," he muttered. "We're in this together." When they reached their next position, they were ordered to support infantry clearing a village of diehard defenders. The fight was brief but savage, machine guns rattling from stone windows, grenades exploding in narrow alleys. Harrington's tank provided covering fire, the guns' roar echoing off the walls. Through it all, the radio fed them updates. Which streets were clear, where the next nest of resistance had been spotted, where friendly troops were pinned down. The crew moved with precision, never firing blind, never guessing. Afterward, Harrington stood in the village square, littered with rubble and broken carts. A dead horse lay in the dust, flies already gathering. He felt the familiar weight in his chest, relief, grief, exhaustion. But under it all, something else stirred, a sense of inevitability. They were part of a machine that was learning faster than the enemy could adapt. Brenner, miles away, sat with a field phone pressed to his ear, listening to static. The line had gone dead again. He slammed the receiver down, fury flashing across his face. They had lost 3 more tanks today, ambushed, outflanked. Reports came late or not at all. He wrote in his logbook, the ink smudging under his damp hand, "We are fighting shadows. Every time we strike, the enemy is gone before the blow lands. Either they have divine luck or they hear the battlefield better than we do." As night fell again, Harrington's crew prepared for another move. Ramirez tested the radio, tuned it until the signal was perfect. "Clear as a bell," he said, satisfied. Harrington climbed back into the turret, settling into the commander's seat. For a moment, he rested his hand on the radio casing, feeling the faint hum. Somewhere out there, other crews were doing the same, thousands of men linked by invisible currents. The war was no longer just about who had the biggest gun, the thickest armor. It was about who could speak and be heard. When the next order came through, a push toward the northern coast to cut off retreating German divisions, it sounded calm, almost routine. But Harrington felt the weight of it settle on his shoulders. Each message now carried not just coordinates but destiny, a thread pulling them step by step toward the heart of Europe. He looked out across the darkened hills, where distant flashes lit the horizon. "Mount up," he said quietly. "We've got work to do." The engine roared, drowning the night's quiet. The tank turned toward the road, its headlight cutting a pale path ahead. Behind them, the radio whispered once more, a soft pulse of static, the sound of an army breathing together, preparing for the long road that would lead them all the way to the next great leap. Italy. Rain hammered down on the Italian hills, turning roads into slurry and washing the dust of Sicily from the Sherman's hulls. Harrington leaned from the commander's hatch, water soaking his helmet, running in cold rivulets down his neck. They had crossed from the blistering heat of Sicily into a new theater, a darker, muddier war where every bend in the road could hide mines, where every farmhouse could conceal a Panzerfaust team. Italy was a labyrinth, and they were the steel rats forced to burrow through it. Ramirez's voice cut through the sound of the storm, clear as if he were whispering in Harrington's ear. "Command says we hold until dawn. There's enemy movement near the pass." His fingers never left the radio dials. No matter how wet, how cold, how close death pressed, Ramirez kept the lines alive, coaxing clarity from the hiss and crackle. The men trusted his hands almost as much as they trusted Harrington's orders. At first light they rolled forward. The fog was so thick it seemed to muffle sound, the world reduced to the growl of the engine and the hiss of the radio. They were halfway through the pass when the first shot came, a German shell slamming into the earth just ahead, spraying rock fragments against the Sherman's hull. O'Malley threw the tank into gear, tracks grinding as they swung for cover. "Gun left," Harrington barked. Donnelly swung the turret. Through the mist, a German Pak-40 gun revealed itself like a phantom, crew working frantically to reload. Donnelly's shot thundered, smashing the gun apart, sending men scattering. The radio came alive again, crisp, calm. A forward observer relayed that 2 more guns were dug in further up the slope. Harrington ordered smoke rounds, shrouding the pass in a white curtain. They advanced under cover, one slow turn of the tracks at a time, hearts pounding. Each shot they fired was directed by unseen voices, each move coordinated with infantry they could barely glimpse. It was as though the battlefield itself had become a conversation. By nightfall the pass was theirs, but at a cost. 2 Shermans burned behind them, black skeletons glowing red. Harrington stood in the rain, helmet in hand, watching medics carry a wounded tanker past. The man's eyes were open but empty, staring at the sky. The victory tasted bitter, yet the radio had saved them from annihilation, calling in fire, coordinating the flanking units. Without it, the entire column might have been lost. Weeks bled together as the push north continued. Villages fell one by one. Mountains had to be taken, rivers forded under fire. Every battle was a grind, every gain bought with blood. Kane grew quieter with each fight, the freckles of his boyish face lost under soot and exhaustion. Donnelly's humor turned dry and sharp, a shield against grief. Ramirez never stopped tending the radio, as though sheer vigilance could keep fate at bay. In November they were ordered to support an infantry advance on San Pietro. The Germans held the high ground and the approaches were sown with mines. Rain turned the fields into quagmires, bogging the tanks. 4 days they fought yard by yard, shells screaming overhead. At night, Harrington listened to the radio's chatter, the map of the battlefield painting itself in sound, where platoons were pinned down, where engineers cleared paths, where artillery rained down like hammer blows. It was a terrible symphony, but one that kept them alive. One evening, Rucker himself arrived at their bivouac, mud spattered on his boots. He spoke to Harrington quietly by the fire. "We've cracked some of their communications," he said. "They know we're moving faster than they can react. They've started pulling their tanks back before we even hit them." "That's good news," Harrington said, though his voice was flat. Victory had become a grim, grinding thing. "It's good news," Rucker agreed, "but it means they'll be waiting somewhere else. They're learning. They're always learning. We have to stay faster." When San Pietro finally fell, the town was a ruin, nothing left but rubble and silence. Harrington's crew sat on the Sherman's hull, staring at what they'd helped destroy. Kane smoked a cigarette, his hands shaking. "Feels like we killed the whole damn place," he muttered. No one contradicted him. Winter came, and with it new orders they were shipping out. Not back home but west to prepare for something bigger. As the LST rolled in the surf and the tank was lashed down for transport, Harrington stood on deck staring toward the horizon. Behind him, the crew talked in low voices about rumors: England, France, a landing somewhere across the channel. The war was shifting again, growing larger. England was cold and wet and smelled of coal smoke. They trained for weeks on hedgerow fighting, learning how to break through thick walls of earth and green. Engineers showed them steel prongs bolted to their tanks' hulls, rhino devices for busting through the Norman bocage. Every day more equipment arrived, more men, more ships, until the ports and roads seemed to groan under the weight. One evening, Harrington found Ramirez sitting cross-legged beside the radio, tuning through frequencies. Snatches of coded messages, weather reports, orders layered over one another like overlapping ghosts. "Feels like the whole world's talking," Ramirez said. "Feels like the whole world's listening," Harrington replied. Then came June 6, 1944. The channel was a heaving, steel-clad tide, ships from horizon to horizon, the air alive with the thrum of aircraft. The Shermans rumbled off the landing craft into waist-deep surf, water spraying over their bows. Harrington's heart hammered as they crawled up the beach under fire. Machine gun tracers snapped overhead, mortar rounds splashing geysers into the sand. "Keep moving," Harrington shouted, voice raw. Behind them, men fell screaming, medics sprinting forward. The radio squawked orders even here, a lifeline in the chaos. "Push inland, secure the road, link up with paratroopers." They obeyed, grinding up through the dunes and into the first hedgerow. Normandy was a different war entirely. The bocage country was a green maze, each field a trap, each turn a possible kill zone. German Panthers lurked, their guns able to punch through Sherman armor with ease. More than once, Harrington's crew escaped death by seconds. A warning over the radio, a call to back up, to shift left, to wait until smoke obscured the enemy line. One afternoon, as they rolled into a sunken lane, a shell hit the lead tank, blowing the turret clean off. The crew scrambled out screaming, aflame. Donnelly swore and fired blindly, smashing a hedgerow where the muzzle flash had come from. Harrington called for artillery, his voice breaking with urgency. Within minutes, the lane erupted in explosions, silencing the German position. But the price weighed heavy. That night, the crew sat in silence, the fire casting their faces in gold. Kane stared into the flames, lips pressed tight as though afraid to speak lest the grief spill out. The campaign pushed on. St. Lo, Operation Cobra, the breakout. Harrington's Sherman became part of the spearhead, punching through German lines. The radios guided them, calling airstrikes that turned strong points into smoking craters. They moved faster than they had in Italy, faster than anyone had thought possible. German defenses cracked. The enemy began to retreat, leaving behind wrecked armor and abandoned guns. Yet victory never felt clean. Each step forward left more dead behind, friend and foe alike. Harrington wrote letters to the families of 2 crewmen lost to mines, his handwriting stiff, his words formal. Donnelly took to polishing the gun barrel after every fight, as though by keeping it clean he could ward off the next death. Ramirez's hands were cracked from cold and grime, but he still tuned the radio each morning with the same precision, as though the war depended on his touch. Brenner, now commanding a smaller, battered unit, watched the retreat from a hill near Falaise. Smoke rose from the pocket where German divisions were being encircled and destroyed. He listened to reports coming in too late, orders that could no longer be carried out. His men fought bravely, but each day they were driven back, each night he had fewer tanks to command. He stared at the enemy lines and wondered if there had ever been a moment they truly had a chance to stop this tide. After the breakout, the war moved faster. Paris was liberated, the Allied armies rolling toward the Rhine. Harrington's crew had been tempered by fire, Veterans now, faces leaner, eyes older. When replacements joined their unit, they treated them with quiet kindness, guiding them through the rituals of survival, how to bail out quickly, how to trust the radio above all else. But the closer they came to Germany, the more desperate the fighting grew. In the Hurtgen forest, rain and mud swallowed men whole. Trees were shattered by shellfire, trunks turned into deadly splinters. Harrington's tank fought through terrain so close that the barrels of their guns brushed branches. Every transmission from Ramirez felt like a thread pulling them out of darkness, keeping them from vanishing into that green hell. One morning, after a night of ceaseless shelling, Harrington climbed from the tank to find Kane sitting on the track, head in his hands. "I can't hear right," Kane said when Harrington touched his shoulder. "Ears are ringing so bad it feels like I'm underwater." "You'll be fine," Harrington said, though worry gnawed at him. They needed every man. They needed the crew whole. But the war was grinding them down, one fragment at a time. When they finally broke through the forest, winter was closing in. The air smelled of snow, of something vast and waiting. Orders came down. The division was to rest, refit, prepare for the final push into Germany. That night, Harrington lay awake in his tent, listening to the faint murmur of the radio from Ramirez's corner. The voices were calm, routine, supply reports, weather, patrols. But Harrington felt the tension coiling in his gut. The war was not over. Something was building beyond the quiet, beyond the cold. Far away, Brenner stood beside a map lit by lantern light. His superior traced a line through the Ardennes, outlining a plan that promised to turn the tide, to smash the Allies and throw them back. Brenner said nothing, but inside he felt a grim fire. If there was one last chance to silence the voices that had haunted him since Sicily, this would be it. In the dark, Harrington finally closed his eyes, hearing the radio's soft hiss like a whisper of fate. The crew slept around him, their breathing steady, the tank outside looming like a sentinel. Snow began to fall, silent, unbroken. The world seemed to hold its breath, waiting for what would come next. Snow lay thick on the Ardennes, muffling sound, turning the forest into a white cathedral where every movement felt sacrilegious. Harrington stood in the commander's hatch, breath fogging in the bitter air, listening to the distant growl of engines beyond the trees. Reports had trickled in through the radio all morning, enemy armor massing, paratroopers cut off, roads choked with refugees. The Germans had come roaring back, a final desperate gamble to break the Allied line. "Feels wrong," Donnelly muttered. I pressed to the site. "Whole forest too damn quiet." "They're out there." "They're out there," Harrington confirmed. He reached down to squeeze Ramirez's shoulder. "Stay sharp on that net. We'll need every second." The first shells landed just after dawn, shaking snow from the trees. German armor surged through the mist, gray phantoms with black crosses on their hulls. Harrington barked orders, the turret swinging to meet the threat. Donnelly's first shot turned the lead half-track into a fireball. The radio crackled with frantic calls, units falling back, others moving to plug gaps. The battlefield became a storm of voices, overlapping, urgent, alive. Left flank collapsing. Ramirez shouted over the din, "They're calling armor support now, that's us." O'Malley gunned the engine, treads grinding ice, and the Sherman lurched forward. They burst from the tree line into a clearing where American infantry were pinned behind snowdrifts, tracer fire cutting across the white field. Harrington called for smoke, covering their advance, then shouted for Donnelly to fire. Shell after shell thundered, until the German machine guns fell silent. The infantry waved, rallied, pushed forward. But the fight wasn't over. As they crested the next ridge, a panzer loomed out of the haze, Brenner's tank, its gun already traversing toward them. For a heartbeat, the two machines stared at each other across the snow. "On!" Donnelly roared. The Sherman's gun fired first, the shot slamming into the panzer's glassy plate and bouncing away in a spray of sparks. The German round came a heartbeat later, striking their front armor with a deafening clang that nearly split their ears. "Back us up, O'Malley," Harrington shouted. "Ramirez, get me artillery on these coordinates." Ramirez was already calling, voice tight but steady, relaying position, target, urgency. The reply came quick, "Fire mission inbound, 30 seconds. 30 seconds could be forever." The Panzer fired again, the round smashing into a nearby Sherman, killing it instantly. Donnelly cursed and reloaded, sweat freezing on his brow despite the cold. He aimed lower, breathing hard. "Hit that track," Harrington barked. The shot landed true, shattering the Panzer's treads. Brenner's tank slewed sideways, crippled but not dead. Its turret continued to turn, guns seeking them even as artillery shells began to fall. The earth shook, snow spraying in fountains. Inside the Panzer, Brenner gave the order to bail out. He helped his loader climb free, then paused, glancing once more at the battlefield. He saw the Shermans, saw the infantry advancing, saw the coordination that had haunted him since Sicily, voices guiding every move, an army that fought as one mind. He felt the bitter edge of admiration cut through his despair. Then he leapt clear as the final shell struck, turning the Panzer into a blackened carcass. Harrington watched the enemy crew scatter across the snow. For a moment he considered firing again, finishing it, but he lowered his hand. They were beaten. That was enough. The battle raged for hours, but the tide had turned. By nightfall, the Americans held the crossroads, their line unbroken. The price was high. Wrecked tanks smoked in the moonlight, their hulls still warm. Medics worked under flares, their shadows long and gaunt against the snow. Harrington climbed from the tank and stood in the stillness, every muscle aching. Donnelly joined him, lighting a cigarette with shaking hands. "Thought that was it," he said quietly. "So did I," Harrington admitted. He looked back at the Sherman, at Ramirez still hunched over the radio, adjusting the dial, ensuring the net was clear. That constant hiss filled the air, the sound of life continuing, of connection unbroken. They buried Kane 2 days later, the youngest of them, killed by shrapnel when the Germans counterattacked one last time. Harrington spoke few words at the graveside, the breath from his lips freezing as he promised they would keep moving, keep talking, keep fighting. When they returned to the tank, Ramirez wordlessly handed him the headset. "Command wants us on the road," Ramirez said. "They're saying the enemy's pulling back." Harrington slid the headset on, listening to the orders, the coordinates, the next objective. Each voice he heard was another life, another thread in the vast web that stretched across the front. The war was still far from done, but something had shifted. They had endured the worst the enemy could throw at them and were still standing. They rolled forward through the silent forest, the snow crunching under their treads. Behind them, the field where Brenner's tank had burned lay quiet, only black scars in the white to mark what had happened. Somewhere beyond the trees, the enemy was retreating, their chance to break the line lost. Harrington looked up at the sky, gray and heavy with more snow. "Let's finish this," he said, not just to his crew but to the world itself. The Sherman's engine growled, the radio hissed, and the column pushed on toward Germany. They were no longer just 5 men in a tank. They were part of something larger, something unstoppable, bound together by the invisible voices that had saved them again and again. As they disappeared into the forest, the wind picked up, carrying away the smoke, carrying away the silence. In its place came the faint, steady crackle of radio chatter, the sound of a war not yet over but already turning toward victory. And in that sound lay the final truth, not in the thickness of steel, not in the roar of engines, but in the fragile, unbroken thread of communication did survival, and triumph, truly live.